Hi, and welcome to Crash Course Cryptozoology. Today I'd like to discuss a particularly controversial piece of testimony from a particularly controversial case in cryptozoology. It also happens to be a quite peculiar and anomalous case in cryptozoology, which is perhaps fitting considering Halloween's right around the corner. The case is that of the Loveland frogman or the Loveland frog. If you're unfamiliar with the case, I will give you a brief rundown now. And if you are familiar with the case, feel free to skip ahead to where I actually begin to discuss the testimony at hand. The Loveland frog was described as, for lack of a better term, a bipedal reptilian humanoid about 4 to 5 feet tall with particularly frog-like features, although testimonies do tend to leave the species identity of this reptilian rather ambiguous. There are claims that there was a report of Loveland frogmen in the 1950s. The report tends to be so vague and rather complicated or inconsistent throughout different versions that it's often disregarded. Instead, we'll be taking a look at the 1972 report, which is really when the legend starts up. Today we'll be examining the testimony of Officer Mark Mathews. Mark Mathews was not the first officer to report such a sighting in Loveland, Ohio. Rather, it was his colleague, Ray Shockey. Officer Shockey reported that on March 3rd of 1972, at around 1 o'clock in the morning, he witnessed a strange animal hunkered down in the road particularly being Riverside Drive near the Little Miami River, and that once he approached it, he actually witnessed it stand upright, walk over to a guardrail, climb over it, and leave the vicinity. Officer Shockey described the animal as having leathery skin, being between 3 and 4 feet tall, and looking like a frog or other reptile. 2 weeks after this incident is when Mark Mathews steps in. Officer Mathews reported seeing a very similar creature lying down by the road, and according to his original story, which it should be noted took place along the same stretch of road, Riverside Drive, Mathews had attempted to shoot the creature but had missed and watched as it walked away, again bipedally. Mathews' account even contributed to a sketch of the sighting done by, I believe, Mathews' sister, which has become an icon in the case. Originally, that was roughly where the story ended. There have been subsequent sightings since then, but none so sensationalized as the accounts of these two officers. The story has changed multiple times since 1972. The first story change, to my knowledge, happened between 1972 and the 1990s, when Mathews ended up claiming that it was in fact a large iguana that he had shot in the road that he claims is about 3 feet long, and that he had actually gotten the identity of the animal confirmed by local police. The story changed slightly again in 2016, when Mathews actually claimed that Ray Shockey had been shown the carcass of the iguana and confirmed it was the animal that he too had seen 2 weeks prior. The glaring problem really, of course, being that the iguana does not match Shockey's report to any extent, nor does it match Mathews' original report in 1972. Even with the claims that the iguana was sickly and missing a tail and was rather long, there's no way that it would stand 3 to 4 feet tall and step with its 2 legs over a guardrail. It's simply not possible for iguana anatomy. Of course, the alternative is rather far-fetched as well. That being said, the fact that Mathews' testimony changed deserves a bit more examination than simply an overview of anatomy. Because Mathews is so linked with Shockey, it seems proper as well to examine Shockey's testimony. So, who was Shockey? Shockey had joined the Loveland police force on July 12, 1971. This encounter that he allegedly had happened a bit less and up to a year, only a year, after he had been hired. For those of you who have worked in law enforcement, or really any team-orientated job for that matter, you'll recall that rookies, so to speak, have the most on the line if they happen to mess up. Ray Shockey doesn't seem like he would have stood any gain from making such an outrageous claim, especially in a small, religious community like Loveland was. Mathews, who was more experienced than Shockey, was perhaps even putting more on the line by saying, and I quote, "I could somehow tell from his demeanor that he did see something." Validating what Shockey said to any extent wouldn't have looked good for Mathews, let alone having his own report under his belt as well. So the two of them stood not much to gain, and if they had anything to gain, that which they would have lost far outweighed it, especially in regards to community reputation. Still, they told their stories originally, and their stories are quite removed from the iguana description. Then, of course, there's the iguana description itself. One would think, especially considering that Mathews' report was filed only 2 weeks after Shockey's historical report, that the iguana being found would make headlines, or there would at least be a section in a newspaper about the owner of the iguana perhaps being upset with the police department or saying a word on the capturing of this rather large iguana. As far as one can find without contacting the police department of Loveland itself, no such articles or reports were ever printed. A search across the internet for anything in 1972 in Loveland, Ohio, relating to a shot iguana or a carcass of an iguana or an escaped iguana simply does not seem to yield any results. Almost as though it didn't happen. Now, of course, that isn't a statement that is meant to validate the idea of the Loveland frog. However, the fact that neither officer stood to gain a good deal from making the reports that they did, that there were no pieces of evidence to back up Mathews' changing story, but that Mathews went on a limb and changed it anyway, seems to suggest that at the very least, the story being in the limbo that it's in right now shouldn't be the case. There seems to still be a mystery here. And it doesn't seem as though a crucial component of that mystery is keen on telling the truth. And therefore, it shouldn't be treated as such. I'd like to know what all of you think of this testimony in the comments, because there obviously is the possibility that Mathews did in fact shoot an iguana, that there simply was no news articles, and that he simply is quite tired of the story. The problem, of course, being that historical evidence doesn't seem to back this up. But I'm no historian, I'm no psychologist, I am doing my best to find what I can on the subject. And I'd love to know if anyone has any additional information on this case. That being said, until next time.